Well, thanks for joining. I'm going to talk about some environmental 101 for commercial transactions this morning. So I'll be kind of talking through some material. Feel free to stop me at any time and ask questions. We'll keep it pretty informal. I'll just go through some of the material and things that I understand about environmental and try to keep it pertaining to commercial real estate. Um, but yeah, thanks for joining. Stop me anytime, and I encourage people chiming in, or else it's just me talking the whole time. So um, yeah, it's lovely day out there. Hopefully, you guys are doing something fun this afternoon. But for now, I'll just jump right into environmental. So, um, environmental concerns for commercial real estate transactions. Um, I'm gonna start off with some interaction and ask you guys one question. Um, what do you think is perhaps the most um, important part of environmental for a real estate transaction? Why is the status of a property's environmental health important for a commercial transaction? Anybody have an idea?
Lending?
Lending, I think, is the right answer there. There's all sorts of answers that you could have come up with. Obviously, value comes to mind, but I think lending is the number one uh, reason to be aware of the environmental aspect of a commercial deal. Every commercial lender will be asking for an environmental site assessment on a commercial transaction. So I think that lending is, uh, and for that reason alone, it's the number one, reason that we should be aware of the environmental aspects, and something that we need to train our buyers and sellers to understand. A lot of the, we are real estate professionals, so we understand, property and transactions. A lot of the commercial buyers and sellers, they might not necessarily be, experts in commercial transactions. They might be business owners. They know their business very well. They bought some property to facilitate their, maybe it's manufacturing, maybe it's, retail, whatever it is. And then it's time to sell or expand or whatever. And they don't understand how the environmental aspect impacted it. Maybe they bought a property that somebody did their job properly and had an environmental ESA done before the sale, and it wasn't an issue, so it didn't come up. But now they've been manufacturing there for quite a while, and maybe the environmental status has changed. But and I'm going to try to keep this related to to real estate, because obviously, like, we can go off and um, talk about industrial or whatever, but it's very important before we buy or sell. If we're helping our sellers, it's important to prepare our sellers and try to get them to do some environmental work before an actual listing. I guess a lot of us come from the, more residential transactions, and it would be the equivalent of like staging your house or getting some work done to your house before sale so that the inspection is going to pass. Like, obviously we have to do that with the buildings too in commercial, but the environmental aspect is possibly, more important depending on the product type, especially if it's an industrial property. We need to encourage our sellers before, a listing, to to do the environmental work. And I'll just jump right into the ESA. Can anybody tell me what ESA stands for? I think I already mentioned it, but there's some different acronyms that we use. I want to make sure you guys understand what they are. The ESA is Environmental Site Assessment. That's where, we've got phase one, phase two. A lot of people, talk about a phase three, but I'm just going to talk, pretty generally about the phase one, two, and generally the third phase, as most people call it. It's not necessarily an actual third phase, but phase one is basically a paperwork exercise. It's environmental consultants doing their homework, looking at the past history of the property, talking to the owners of the property, talking to past owners, tenants, anybody that they can talk to get a history of the environmental for this property. And that will include pulling up records from the environmental ministries to look for nearby landfills or gas stations, or spills that happened, or buried fuel tanks. Anything that could potentially cause contamination on a site will often be identified in a phase one just through research that they do. So phase one, if it comes back clean, meaning the current owner is not using the property for any, with the current owner or past owners haven't used the property, that might have potential to cause contamination. A phase one could come back clean, and basically that will come back with the consultants saying that they don't require further investigation with a phase two. If we have a report of a clean phase one ESA, that will be enough for the banks to be satisfied and have the property qualify for lending. I'm going to take a quick pause, say hi to Tia and Meraldo that joined, and just we're just going through environmental aspects of commercial transactions. So feel free to chime in anytime. We've just gone through, kind of the ESA, the environmental site assessment, in a phase one, and why it's why it's the most important, part of the environmental aspect of a commercial transaction, and that's because the banks will be looking for the environmental aspect to lend on it. So if a phase one comes back clean with no further investigation recommended, then it will qualify for good lending rates, and everybody's happy. If we prepare our sellers to do this before a listing, this takes, and we've got a clean environmental phase one in hand, this takes any objection away from a buyer. It gives them more confidence, and it shortens up the conditional period often. A phase one report can take anywhere around a month, and it can cost $2,500 to $3,500 depending on the scope of the property. So that's an inexpensive for a business owner who's selling a commercial property. This is inexpensive assurance that a buyer can offer top dollar. If we've got an industrial property and or any commercial property for that matter, and a buyer thinks that there's potential contamination, they're going to offer less, and they start throwing around large round numbers like, oh, this property is going to cost $50,000 or $100,000 or $150,000 to do the environmental work and to get all the studies done, and then remediate if there's any cleanup necessary. So we want to make sure that our sellers are prepared, and they if there is contamination, identify it and hopefully clean it up before and get a clean bill of health before they actually go to sale. And this is going to create a lot more value for the property, a lot more than they're going to actually spend cleaning it up, depending on the property. I'm obviously not talking about giant waste disposal sites or really heavy industrial contamination. But for the most part, we need to educate our buyers and sellers in what they can expect with the environmental. So I'll stick on the environmental site assessment topic and talk about, if a property in a phase one investigation identifies any potential for contamination, that will immediately lead to a phase two. And anything that's, within a close proximity to a gas station or a landfill, certainly. But even just something that's been used for, manufacturing where they're using, some type of chemical contaminants. A really big one to look out for in plazas and even in the city are dry cleaners. They've historically been a huge source of contamination. A lot of the dry cleaning agents that they use, you know, make their way into small leaks in the ground if the underground plumbing has and the sewers have small leaks, and um, that can be a big source of contamination, and these things make or break property sales. And um, a property, something to consider that I just thought of that should be discussed is the extent of contamination, which will be identified in a phase two. But the extent of contamination is largely based on. Can somebody tell me a reason or a ground type or a soil type that would um, that would be worse for contamination and cause a lot more cost to clean up? Because some ground types uh, are are easier to clean up or don't allow for the contamination to travel very far. Can somebody speak to that? Why would a property um, become more contaminated or cost more to clean up than another?
Are you speaking of what type of soil, or because it's near water, or I'm
Yeah,
not
you're
sure
on the right
exactly.
track.
Okay, so the type of soil. I don't know. I've been involved in a couple of contaminations, but I don't remember the type of soil just because it was close. Um, I don't know the type of soil, but
So there's two types of soil or ground conditions that I can think of that are very good to have close to the surface. Tia just wrote sand, and sand is definitely a correct answer. That sand is very permeable, and if you have contamination that's leaking into the ground, and you've got really deep sand. Some properties could have 30 or 40 feet of sand or more underneath a building. And that contamination will not stop. It will leach its way all through the sand, all the way down. And obviously, the further down you go, the more volume of material is contaminated. And I know some properties on Bank Street in Ottawa that had a dry cleaner in the building, and there's 50 feet of sand under the building, and there's almost no way to clean it up. Um, you know, you would have to remove the entire building and dig 50 feet down and 100 feet out in every direction. This contamination is just leaking everywhere. And it's because sand, it's permeable. We use sand in septic beds, and we use sand to backfill around houses because it's permeable. Water drains through it and doesn't sit in it. So if you've got sand, absolutely, Tia, um, it's going to create more contamination. So Kevin just chimed in on the chat and he said clay and rock is not bad. So that is the other absolute, those are the two, I call them soil types, but they're not soil types, they're ground conditions. Bedrock, and specifically bedrock, like if it's crushed rock, then that's permeable. But the two impermeable conditions that I can think of are bedrock and clay. Clay is not permeable. So if you have a layer of clay, 5 feet down under a property, um, that contamination will stop at the clay and it will not permeate it. Same thing with bedrock. Um, as soon as the contamination hits bedrock, if it's solid bedrock without big cracks in it and fissures, it will stop and it will not permeate into the rock. So I know of some properties that have bedrock 2 feet down underneath the building they're contaminated, but it's not a big deal. The slab, the concrete slab might be right on bedrock, and the parking lot has contamination in it, but it's only a couple feet of gravel before it hits bedrock. These are a lot less expensive to clean up because you just make your way to the bedrock, remove the material, bring it to the dump, and you're done with it. But it's not 50 feet deep and 1,000 truckloads at $1,000 a truckload to truck it to Moose Creek dump and dispose of it. So it's important to understand that the soil conditions drastically dictate how much an environmental problem can impact a property and the cost to clean it up. And Morena, you mentioned nearby water course or water. That's absolutely a consideration. A lot of properties, if the contamination is contained or it's not traveling, far from the building or onto somebody else's property, there's no real reason that we need to clean it up unless, they want to sell the property and a buyer's trying to dictate that they sell. Another reason that we could be mandated to clean up a property is if we were looking to expand a building or build something new, getting a new site plan application or a building permit to build something new. The municipality might dictate that a past spill be cleaned up. But if there's a water course and that leaching through some sand and it finds its way to a nearby water course, and that is a reason that if the conservation authority or even a public agent, somebody from the public complains and says, hey, we see oil by stream or lake or river or whatever, that could be an actionable requirement for a property owner to create some barriers and mitigation response to cleaning it up. So these are all things to consider. This is environment to be on your mind and in front and center, because it absolutely affects value. And if you're under the environmental aspect well, um, you are a better commercial agent and you're more equipped to help people. I just to qualify a lot of this, for a years in real estate. Before that, my life was in civil and industrial construction. And at one point in time, I was in charge of all the land and property, um, from an environmental standpoint as well, with sand pits and quarries, and pretty heavy use for the land, and the environmental is quite heavy. So I'm specialized in environmental. I've been involved with numerous cleanups, and I've since then commercial transactions helped a lot of people um, buying property that buying or selling property that has contamination, or at the very least been able to uh, you know guide them through different aspects of cleanups. I'm working on one right now that there's an environmental hazard. There was an old generator on the building oil tank many years ago. We're through the environmental aspect right now, but the seller has done their due diligence. They've done a full phase two, um, and they've done some risk mitigation. So they've identified how much contamination there is, and they've taken steps to mitigate it, meaning they've put some impermeable barriers. They've put clay so that the the contamination can't go any further away from what it is, and it's just something that the sellers appear that they're or the buyers appear that they're going to live with. They are going to deal on property because if the property had no environmental contamination, it would probably be worth $2.5 million. But because environmental contamination and the lenders won't lend on it, these are have to be basically cash buyers, and the pool of buyers is a lot smaller. So, obviously supply and demand dictates price. So with a lot less demand for the property, they're going to get a deal on the property. They're going to enjoy the property and you know instead understanding the environmental risks and knowing that they're not going to have to clean it up. They're going to be able to enjoy the property and use it for the next 20-30 years and cash flow from it. But we've identified the environmental aspects, working through it, and they seem very comfortable knowing that, hey, you know what, we're getting $1 million off property because the environmental report says that if they ever had to clean it all up, it's under the building, and you'd have to do some building demolition, and it could up to $1 million to clean up. But they're comfortable with it. The contamination hasn't moved in 10 years, and there's no reason that it should. So understanding the environmental aspects are going to help myself and these client through the deal. So that's talking about the phase two ESA. This is a little bit more onerous. If a phase one identifies need for further investigation, it will lead to a phase two. A phase two can be anywhere between on an average size property, let's call it $5,000 to $15,000, to the cost for the phase two ESA itself, and it can take 2 to 3 months. So if you're buying a property and there isn't environmental evidence, with the seller having prepared a phase one and two ESA already, we need to prepare our buyers that it could take a few weeks, 3-4 weeks for a phase one, and then maybe an additional 2 to 3 months to complete a phase two. And a phase two being, $10,000 to $15,000, maybe $20,000. If it's a really big property and it's been used for heavy industrial use, and they've got to do soil samples all over the property, it could cost $30,000, 40. Like it can get pretty expensive when you're talking industrial and permeable type soils like sand. Certainly if you're getting into the construction world and heavy industrial, it can get pricey. So we need to prepare our buyers for that. But a lot of these large commercial, buyers and sellers, they are prepared for these numbers. They could be buying, million or multi-million. This is just you have to pay for, your studies, but it's best for us to educate them on timelines and potential risk and how it affects transactions and the properties. So a phase two, just going a little bit deeper, it's the phase one we identified as a paperwork exercise and a historical exercise for environmental consultants and engineers. A phase two is actually the physical sampling. It's identifying, where there should be samples taken from the property to actually test and see if there is contamination. So that could be core sampling under this, through a slab of a building and seeing if there's contamination underneath the building itself. That could be pouring through a parking lot and seeing, what kind of contamination might be under the parking lot or in any aspects outside of the building. Um, Digging with backhoes, test, and actually testing the soil or the media to see, if there's actually contamination. So I think the majority of the contamination that is found, we're talking about hydrocarbons here. Hydrocarbons are, gas, oil, these kinds of things were used. The old furnaces were a huge source of contamination. Obviously, buried underground tanks, gas stations with buried underground tanks, any underground oil and gas tanks are very likely to have contamination found around them. They leak over time. The fittings that they put get a leak over time, and gas and oil gets out and into the ground, and that's something that has to be taken care of. Generally speaking, like an oil tank from a smaller building, it doesn't have to cost tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to clean up. We could be talking about a couple truckloads, a couple dump truck loads. Each dump truck holds, call it 22 tons of material, and two dump truck loads worth of material that's around an old oil tank at $1,000 a load. We might only be talking about a few months or a few thousand to remediate, but the whole process is key to understanding the the cost time money. The phase two cost time and money. Between those two, if we're talking about $20,000 and 2 to 4 months just to spend $3,000 for the cleanup, the reports often take more time and money than the actual cleanup in itself. I'll just briefly talk about the phase three ESA, and what a lot of people call a phase three. They teach it in real estate schools, that there's a phase three, but when it comes to industry and how these things are actually discussed in the field, nobody talks about phase three. Basically, the phase two identifies the type and volume of contamination that's necessary, and it also uh, discusses recommendations for cleanup, how much it might cost, methods for cleanup, and the phase three, so to speak, is the actual cleanup itself. But basically, in the industry, the environmental consultants just use it as a continuation of the phase two, and their phase two will continue and evolve with any type of actual remediation and cleanup, and it will eventually resolve. And the phase two, they'll just continue on the same phase two environmental site assessment, and just keep adding to the report until there's a history of the property has been remediated, cleaned up, and no further action is recommended from the environmental consultants. If your phase two, ends up uh, uh, evolving into a report that comes to a conclusion that says the environmental consultants do not recommend any further action, that's as good as getting a clean bill of health, and now the property's qualified for lending. Um, oh, that's instead of what I guess they probably teach in real estate schools, in the actual industry, that would be the phase three, I think, in most of the how it's taught is that's the actual cleanup itself. But in practicality, it's a continuation of the phase two, until the property is actually cleaned up, or until there's a record of site condition that's been obtained. And the record of site condition is one further step than a clean bill of health on a phase one or a phase two. This is where um, a property is either being changed zones from industrial to residential or from commercial to residential, um, or there has been contamination and somebody's going for a building permit or site plan approval, and the ministry dictates that a record of site condition, the ministry or the municipality dictates that a record of site condition is necessary. And what this is, a record of site condition, is basically the environmental consultants um, consulting with the environmental ministries, Minister of the Environment, or some of the conservation authorities, working back and forth until everybody's content that there's no more contamination here. And the property owner is free and clear to go ahead and build houses. Normally this is we're always trying to protect something with the environmental site assessments. We're either trying to protect humans that are living on properties, and residential is the most sensitive land use. So if you're going from industrial or commercial to a residential use, there's going to be a record of site condition necessary to make sure that we're protecting the humans that are going to reside there. And but the record of site condition, of obtaining a clean record of site condition, is your environmental consultants going back and forth with the ministry, and everybody being content, and the ministry being content that there's no more contamination. So a phase two, with your environmental consultants, might say, we do not recommend any further action at this time. Then the phase two gets submitted to the ministry or the conservation authority, and they might come back and recommend more testing. So a bank might lend on a clean phase one and two, but the Ministry of the Environment, or one of the conservation authorities, might still come back and say, hey, before you build houses, we actually require you to test in these other areas and identify it on the site plan. And that could come back and forth for months. I've seen a record of site condition take over a year. So this is really when we're getting into like more development, subdivision developments, or larger scale site plan applications for buildings. But that's the ultimate bill of health, is when the ministry or the municipality signs off on a record of site condition, and now the site is deemed clean by everybody, and you can go ahead and actually get your building permit and start digging for your building. Does anybody have any questions with the ESA or the record of site condition? I've been talking for a while, and love to hear people chime in if you've got any experience with this or something that happened.
So generally, if you don't have a pocket full of money, well, from my experience, it's hard to get lending. So, correct?
Correct.
So I've experienced this, and that's the challenge. So it's from an individual who's not a builder and who needs to depend on lenders. I went through very many many phase one, phase two, and we didn't continue to remediation, but it was a trying experience. And even as a realtor, so having a buyer, um, walking them through that process, I could only tell you that patience is virtue. Because they will just it months and months and back and going back and forth between, the seller and the banks and then at the end of the day not completing the project because you couldn't. So it is, I always felt if I have come through that situation again, that if I'm representing a buyer, is to really give them really clear, as you mentioned at the beginning, Cris, expectations that this may go south and you may spend some money.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why that's exactly why I'm discussing the different phases, the different timelines, and the different costs. We absolutely need to educate our buyers and sellers on this, because a lot of them have great expectations, and they need to go into this, these ventures eyes wide open. But you can almost guarantee that, if they're not educated on their own and we don't educate them on it, that going through the process will be a lot more startling to them. And I think that the goal is to set expectations, give them an accurate preview of how it's going to go. And if we do that up front, and they still agree to go through it, they're more likely to be vested in the venture, know what they're getting into, and be comfortable with the scenario. If they find out halfway through due diligence, after they've already spent time and money on studies, and a phase one leads to a phase two, and they didn't know it could cost $20,000, but they've already spent 10, they're going to be upset. It's going to be a bad experience. But if we've prepared them up front and they've mentally prepared themselves for, the battle, if you will, and the expectation and timeline, we're much more likely to be able to, keep the deal together and have them have a good experience through the whole venture. It's much easier if they agree to it up front and they still go ahead with it and their expectations are set. Like these properties do sell, and people can still be happy buying them, and then once they own them, having regular enjoyment of the property and continuing to cash flow on their venture or run their business or whatever is still possible. So it's definitely, that's the reason I like to talk about it, is to just create awareness and make sure that we're all talking to our buyers and sellers about it before there's an issue.
Could
So
I, sorry, thank you. And
yeah,
could I bring, so the dry cleaner that you're speaking of on Bank Street, would that be Hillary's?
I can't remember the
Oh.
actual company name. I'd have to go digging through properties to find it again, but it was 5 or 6 years back. I came across one.
So it's sitting, so there is one in Old Ottawa South, Hillary's, which is where I used to go all the time, but it's contaminated. We all know that, the community all knows that, the Glebe in Old Ottawa South. And it's still sitting there.
Is there a carpet place in the same plaza?
No, it's actually a standalone. I think it's the corner of, if I'm not mistaken, Cameron and Bank. It's a nice little chunk of land, but we all know it's contaminated. The canal's not very far. The canal's pretty far, but everybody says the canal's pretty close.
Mhm.
But all to say is, so the land is contaminated. I think there was a lawsuit. So the land's sitting there empty. So anyone who buys it obviously has to, like, there's Cedars, which is a food, there's an antique shop. So that whole corner, and there's residential behind it. And that's how it all started, because they were saying it's, seeping into their backyards. And if they have to sell their house, there's a dry cleaner behind us.
Yeah,
So how does how does someone who owns a property like that ever get rid of it?
it can it can be tough, and I'll talk a little bit about liability because this seems like a good time to do it. Um, Obviously, if there's contamination seeping or leaching onto somebody else's property, that is a time where they could be action to clean it up. And it's on the onus or the responsibility or liability is on whoever created the contamination originally. Um, they're the ones that are on the hook to clean it up. The problem exists when the property's changed hands a couple times, or the original person that created the contamination had a corporation that owned a dry cleaner, and the corporation since folded. And there's no real liability left for that original person, or like I said, they could be deceased, and now who do we start pointing fingers at? It eventually falls on the current property owner, and they might get in trouble too if there's the only way to clean up the contamination is to knock the building down, dig down 50 feet right to the walls, and it could cost $2 million. How can they pay for that? So sometimes there's not much that can be done, and even though the owner might end up having fines laid, the solution for the environmental, like from the ministries, is if they can mandate that you clean it up, and if you can't clean it up, they start imposing fines, and the fines uh, can add up. They could be monthly or annual fines, and eventually, if you can't pay the fines, like, that person has to go bankrupt too. And some of these properties just get you know to a point where nobody can really afford to do it, and unfortunately, the surrounding homeowners properties are affected, and everybody suffers. There are some instances out there that if it gets bad enough, sometimes the municipality will step in. Like, if we're talking, um, there's been an environmental hazard that is starting to contaminate nearby neighbors, like wells, if we're in the country, and the aquifer is affected. Like, a municipality might have to step up and say, we need to spend the money on this before the whole community is affected. But um, often it doesn't get too much further than the stigma of, oh well, there's a contaminated gas station in our backyard, and somebody will eventually buy the house because the price gets low enough that they don't mind that there's gas in the ground, but they don't smell it, and it's not bothering really
Right.
anybody. It's in the city. They're not trying to grow a garden and have their food affected. So some of these instances just exist, and there's nothing that anybody can do about it. Sometimes another solution to purchasing one of these properties might be seller financing. The banks won't lend on it. The buyers can't afford to pay all cash. This might be a scenario where the seller has to sell the property at a discount, and then maybe they finance a part of it. If it's $1 million property, maybe they say, hey, look, give me $100,000, and you can chip away at a $900,000 mortgage for the next 20 years at a low interest rate, but somehow getting to the point where it works for both the buyer and the seller. The seller sheds the liability because the ownership changes, but they've trying to recover their investment over time, and the buyer gets some cheap financing and gets to use the property for for whatever purpose they want, but knowing that if they have to build something on it, they're going to have a challenge getting financing. You can still get financing on a contaminated property, but you're into B or C lenders that are they're going to charge a lot. So if a typical commercial mortgage might be 5% right now, you might be paying 10 or 15%. Something 15 is high, but maybe you're paying 10, 12, 13% on a mortgage with a property that's contaminated.
And
So
that, sorry,
yeah.
and that's what I thought when it came to lending is a B or C, but even a B and C wasn't touching it. And it didn't matter what number. It was because the contamination, it was more that even though they did phase 1 and 2, the possibility of it, I'm using my hand so you can't see it, moved on to the property behind it, etc. It was just too much of a risk. for
Yeah.
everyone because there were homes. It wasn't, a little property out in the middle of nowhere where, was a field, which still is bad for growing, but that was the whole mindset. So if I could just change, so there's parts of the city that I know just be, they that uh, just from friends saying that they had an oil tank but in their backyard because when they bought this house. So it's residential in a residential community. There's an oil tank under there. Thankfully, I didn't sell their house, so I didn't have to deal with it. But what do we do? Like, I haven't been in that situation with residential because there's all kinds of things buried in people's backyard now. Hopefully not humans, but dogs and cats and whatever else.
The 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 oil tanks are pretty typical.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily like gas station oil tanks. Like all of the homes used many of our homes used to be heated by oil.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
maybe this is just some people don't understand quite what that means. Our furnace oil is virtually the same as diesel. It's not like sludge that most people think of, like used motor oil, black tar. Oil that comes out of a truck to heat our homes is basically diesel. Same refining process, same stuff, just taxed at a different rate. Anyway, that's just a fun side fact, but a lot of these homes were heated with oil at some point in time, and absolutely they used to bury the oil tanks, even if they were above ground. You'd have small leaks in these oil tanks, and there's some remediation to be done. Generally speaking, the home oil tanks that have leaked are not that large of a problem. There isn't like millions of gallons that have been seeping through there. It, it doesn't usually leach much further than 20 feet in any direction, or less. So the actual cleanup of these oil tanks might be 2 truckloads of material. We're talking about a couple $1,000s. So it's there's no right way to go about it for a residential property. Um, Sometimes people just leave it as is and don't, you know, poke the beehive, because the if there's no record of it that anybody's identifying, there's the residential lenders don't necessarily call for an environmental phase one to
No,
lend on it. So,
no.
a lot of these properties change hands many times without anybody raising flags about, the oil tank that was buried in the backyard.
But
Uh,
the resident who's been living there for 99 years knows that that's how they feel. I mean, my parents' house in the glebe had, but it was inside, it wasn't
yeah,
outside. Um, so they will say, oh yeah, back in the day, we had that. So you kind of think there might be one under there, right? And so that's a disclosure that we have to deal with. I haven't
yep.
had to deal with one. My parents' house, I dealt with it. That was long ago, but
And obviously we are bound
did, yes.
to a disclosure if one of our clients says, "Hey, there
Yeah,
is a tank buried in the backyard."
yeah,
And that's something I choose to just face head on,
yeah,
and that's a disclosure item. And then
yeah,
the buyer's responsibility is to do what they want with it. Maybe they say, ah, you know what, I'm going to take $5,000 or $10,000 off my asking price now, during a conditional period, and maybe there's some type of negotiation that you know makes them happy with it. Maybe they back out. Somebody somewhere will eventually be comfortable with the scenario, at the right
that's
price, and
right, right. But
you
my
know,
guess, backing it out to the lending, I guess that might be I just haven't, I mean, of course, to disclose and do all that, but I don't know if the banks would look at it the same way. I don't know. That's why I'm asking you for because you had you of course you sort of deal with the situation, but I just wondered if you said, yeah, there is an oil tank back there and you have to disclose, and the buyer discloses it, if the lending would be, because it's a residential property and half the city is full of all kinds of stuff underneath the land, right? So I was just curious if you've ever had that experience, that's all.
I have, I've had exactly this. I've had, a disclosure to the buyer,
Right.
and the buyer says, "Take $5,000 off, I'm happy." And
Okay.
they continue to buy it. I don't know with that particular case that I'm thinking of, whether they even disclosed it to their lender or not.
Okay,
Uh,
that's the
you know,
part. Okay, fair enough.
maybe it was disclosed in the realtor remarks, and the printed maybe the printed MLS form that they gave the bank didn't have the
Got
realtor
it.
remarks there. I don't know. Everybody's going to treat the situation a little bit differently.
Mhm.
If I'm on the buy side, I'm certainly disclosing it to my buyers, and letting them know the potential risk and liabilities and cost. At some point in time, they've got to make a decision what they want to do with it. Some buyers will be comfortable with it. Some buyers that won't.
Yeah.
I always just try to have integrity and make sure everybody's aware of it, and at some point in time a decision will be made.
Yeah, thanks. I just was wondering. Thanks.
There's no right or wrong answer for that one.
No,
uh,
it's more of a just a discussion just to keep or at least my head open to other solutions. Thanks.
yep, that's and that's at some price it will always happen.
Mhm.
You know whether and it may be, this may be a discussion with your seller to say, hey, before you list this thing, if there's a tank buried back there, and we might be talking about a couple $1,000s to remove it, why don't you remove it and get it cleaned up, and then you can show a receipt of the removal. It's much better to spend a few $1,000s on removing this tank than a buyer to come along and say, I want $15,000 off the price after we've already negotiated because they found you disclosed the oil tank. eh, and increase the confidence. That's what I like to do, certainly when I'm on the sell side, especially in commercial, is try to get ahead of it and take all of the negotiation power away from the buyer. And if you mitigate the risk and increase the buyer's confidence, you're going to get better dollar for your property in the sale. So
Great,
um,
thank you.
all we can do is try to educate the buyers and the sellers with what we know. It's like that in all other aspects, not just the environment. Obviously, the building envelope. If we we're doing the same thing with the building envelope or the septic, or what have you. So that's kind of my approach, is to hit it head on and try to get ahead of it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Um, so we've taken most of the hour just on the environmental site assessment, and I guess that's environmental 101. There's other environmental aspects that we're looking out for, different studies that come about with different property types, especially with commercial or development. There could be an EIS, which is an environmental impact statement, that might take the some contamination or lack thereof, or just any scope of investigation um, for habitat. An environmental impact statement's often going to be needed if we've got a property that's near a floodplain or wetland, and we want to build something, or have a site plan application. We're going to have to do more investigation with things like environmental impact statements. But we've so I'll probably leave it here, and hopefully next time I'll do an environmental 201, and maybe we can talk about some, different species or floodplain, different habitat type things if we're getting into further development. But hopefully this was informative and everybody got a little bit out of it. Don't hesitate to give me a shout if something comes up, but I think that certainly the environmental site assessment is paramount when we're talking to our buyers and sellers about commercial property. And hopefully we have identified some of the talking points, and you're all able to have better discussions with your clients because of it. But yeah, like I said, reach out in time. Does anybody have any last questions before we go? I'm happy to
Thank
stick
you.
around.
It's really good. It's a good refresher.
Thanks, Chris.
Good stuff. Okay, no problem. Have a great day, everybody, and we'll chat soon.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay, take it easy.